Before we begin, there is something you need to understand. Your soulmate never expected to find themselves in this position. They never imagined that one day they would be forced to make a choice so difficult that it would keep them awake at night, occupy their thoughts during quiet moments, and follow them everywhere they went. Yet that is exactly where they are now. And what makes this situation even more surprising is that the choice wasn't really about plans, circumstances, or timing. At the center of it all was you. Somewhere deep inside, they realized that the feelings they had been trying to manage, ignore, or postpone could no longer remain hidden. A moment arrived that demanded honesty, and suddenly they found themselves standing face to face with emotions they were not prepared to confront. What triggered this wasn't a dramatic event. It wasn't an argument or a major life change. It was something much quieter. Over time, certain thoughts kept returning, no matter how hard they tried to focus on other things. Certain questions refused to disappear. Certain emotions continued appearing when they least expected them. At first, they brushed it aside. They told themselves they were overthinking. They convinced themselves that everything would become clearer if they simply waited long enough. But waiting didn't create clarity. Instead, it created more questions. The longer they delayed facing the truth, the heavier those unanswered questions became. And listen carefully, because this is where everything started changing. Your soulmate reached a point where they could no longer pretend that avoiding a decision was the same as solving a problem. Deep down, they understood that remaining stuck between options was slowly becoming its own choice. Every day they delayed, their heart became louder. Every day they remained uncertain, the emotions grew stronger. Eventually, they realized they had arrived at a crossroads. One path allowed them to continue living exactly as they had before. The other path required courage, honesty, and vulnerability. For the first time, they understood that no matter which direction they chose, their life would never be quite the same again. And that realization changed everything. After realizing that a decision could no longer be avoided, your soulmate found themselves doing something they hadn't done in a very long time. They began looking back, not because they wanted to live in the past, but because their heart kept leading them there. Every time they tried focusing on the future, certain memories would quietly return. Certain moments would appear in their mind without warning. And the more they reflected on those moments, the more they began noticing something they had overlooked before. You were present in many of the memories that still carried emotional weight. Out of all the experiences life had given them, why were these the moments that remained so vivid? Why were these the memories that time refused to erase? At first they tried to dismiss it. They told themselves that everyone remembers certain people from their past. They convinced themselves that it didn't necessarily mean anything significant. But the deeper they looked, the harder it became to ignore what they were discovering. These weren't just random memories. They were moments connected to genuine emotions. Moments that made them feel understood, appreciated, seen, or emotionally connected in ways they hadn't fully recognized at the time. And that realization caught them off guard. Because for so long, they had focused on everything except their true feelings. They had focused on responsibilities, circumstances, timing, and practical concerns. Yet now, all of those things seemed less important than the emotions they could no longer ignore. As the days passed, they found themselves questioning things they once accepted without hesitation. They started wondering why thoughts of you continued appearing when they least expected them. A simple memory would suddenly surface during a busy day. A familiar feeling would return during a quiet evening. Sometimes it wasn't even a specific memory. It was simply an awareness of your presence in their thoughts. The more this happened, the more they realized that you occupied a place in their heart that no one else had quite filled. That realization felt both comforting and unsettling. Comforting because it revealed something meaningful. Unsettling because it forced them to confront emotions they had spent a long time trying to keep under control. And listen carefully, because this is where the inner conflict began growing stronger. Every possible future they imagined seemed to lead back to the same question. What role do you truly play in their life? No matter how they approached the situation, they couldn't avoid that question. Every answer seemed connected to you in some way. Every path they considered eventually brought them back to the same emotional crossroads. They began realizing that the difficult choice they were facing wasn't simply about circumstances. It was about acknowledging how much your connection had influenced them. It was about accepting that your presence had left a deeper impact than they were willing to admit before. The more honest they became with themselves, the clearer everything started to look. They could no longer pretend your influence was temporary. They could no longer convince themselves that these emotions were insignificant. Every reflection revealed another piece of the truth. Every memory carried another clue. And together, those clues pointed toward the same conclusion. You had become one of the most important factors in the decision they were now being forced to make. Not because anyone told them to choose you, not because someone pressured them, but because their own heart kept bringing them back to the same realization. You mattered more than they expected. You mattered more than they admitted. And now that they could finally see that truth clearly, avoiding it was becoming impossible. What started as a period of reflection was quickly turning into something much deeper. It was becoming an awakening that would soon force them to decide whether they were willing to continue living according to fear or finally begin listening to what their heart had been trying to tell them all along. The deeper your soulmate looked into their feelings, the more they realized they were standing in front of a choice they could no longer avoid. This wasn't a simple decision with an obvious answer. It wasn't the kind of choice that could be made in a single moment and forgotten the next day. This choice carried emotional weight. It carried consequences. It carried the potential to change the direction of their life in ways they couldn't fully predict. That is why they spent so much time wrestling with it internally. Part of them wanted to continue following the path they had always known. A path that felt familiar, predictable, and safe. It may not have been perfect, but at least it didn't require them to take emotional risks. At least it didn't force them to confront the vulnerable parts of themselves they had spent years protecting. Yet another part of them kept pulling in the opposite direction. A quieter voice inside their heart continued asking questions they couldn't easily answer. What if safety was no longer enough? What if comfort was preventing them from experiencing something more meaningful? What if the life they truly wanted existed on the other side of a difficult decision? These questions became impossible to ignore. Every time they tried pushing them aside, they returned stronger than before. Every time they convinced themselves to focus on practical reasons, their emotions found a way back into the conversation. It felt as though two different versions of themselves were fighting for control. One side wanted certainty, the other wanted truth. As this inner struggle intensified, your soulmate began imagining different futures. They pictured what life would look like if they continued making choices based on fear. At first, those visions seemed reassuring because they involved fewer risks. There would be no uncomfortable conversations, no uncertainty, no emotional exposure. Everything would remain exactly where it was. But the longer they imagined that future, the heavier it felt. Something important seemed missing. Something essential seemed absent. They couldn't escape the feeling that they would always wonder what could have happened if they had been brave enough to listen to their heart. Then they imagined a different future, A future where they stopped allowing fear to make every decision. A future where they trusted their emotions instead of constantly questioning them. That future felt uncertain, but it also felt alive. It carried possibilities they had not allowed themselves to consider before. For the first time, they realized that meaningful choices are rarely easy. If a decision has the power to change your life, it will almost always require courage. It will almost always involve stepping into the unknown, and your soulmate is beginning to understand that avoiding uncertainty does not always create happiness. Sometimes it simply creates regret. What makes this situation even more powerful is that the choice they are facing is not really about external circumstances anymore. At its core, this has become a choice between two versions of themselves. One version continues hiding behind fear, hesitation, and endless caution. The other version embraces honesty, growth, and emotional truth. That realization changed everything. Suddenly, the decision stopped being about what others might think. It stopped being about appearances or expectations. It became personal. It became a question of whether they were willing to live authentically or continue ignoring what their heart already knew. Now they find themselves at a point where the pressure is growing stronger every day. The more clarity they gain, the harder it becomes to remain undecided. The emotional conflict that once confused them is slowly transforming into understanding. They are beginning to see that every meaningful turning point in life asks for something in return. Sometimes it asks for patience, sometimes it asks for sacrifice, and sometimes it asks for courage. Right now, courage is exactly what your soulmate needs. Because deep inside, they already know that the difficult choice standing before them is not going away. The only question that remains is whether they are ready to stop running from the truth and finally choose the path their heart has been pointing toward all along. After spending so much time caught between fear and truth, something unexpected began happening inside your soulmate. The confusion that once felt overwhelming slowly started losing its power. The endless questions that kept them awake at night no longer seemed as complicated as they once did. Not because every answer had suddenly appeared, but because they were finally looking at the situation from a different perspective. For a long time, they believed the difficult choice in front of them was about circumstances. They thought it was about timing. They thought it was about avoiding mistakes. They thought it was about protecting themselves from possible disappointment. But the more honest they became with themselves, the more they realized those explanations were only covering a deeper issue. The real struggle was never about what might happen. The real struggle was about whether they were willing to trust what their heart had been telling them all along. This realization didn't arrive all at once. It appeared gradually through quiet moments of reflection. Moments when there were no distractions. Moments when they could no longer escape their own thoughts. During those moments they started noticing a pattern. Nearly every major decision they regretted had one thing in common. Fear was involved. Fear had convinced them to wait. Fear had convinced them to stay silent. Fear had convinced them to avoid risks. And although those choices may have protected them from temporary discomfort, they often left behind something else. Regret. The regret of wondering what could have happened if they had been brave enough to choose differently. That realization hit them harder than they expected, because suddenly they could see how much influence fear had over their life. They could see how often they had chosen safety over authenticity. They could see how many opportunities had slipped away simply because they hesitated too long. And as they reflected on the choice they are facing now, they began asking themselves a new question. Instead of asking, "What is the safest option?" they started asking, "What is the most honest option?" That single question changed everything. Because honesty and safety are not always the same thing. Sometimes honesty requires vulnerability. Sometimes honesty requires uncertainty. Sometimes honesty asks people to step beyond their comfort zone and trust something they cannot fully control. As this shift in perspective continued, your soulmate started feeling something they hadn't felt in a long time. Relief. The relief that comes when someone stops fighting against themselves. For so long, they had been trying to convince themselves that certain emotions didn't matter. They had been trying to minimize the importance of certain memories. They had been trying to rationalize feelings that refused to disappear. But now, instead of resisting those emotions, they are beginning to accept them. And acceptance has brought a surprising sense of peace. Because deep down, the heart becomes exhausted when it spends too much time denying its own truth. The more they accept what they feel, the clearer everything becomes. They no longer feel the need to create endless excuses. They no longer feel the need to search for complicated explanations. The truth is becoming simple. You became important to them. The connection became important to them. And the choice they are facing is important because it forces them to decide whether they will honor that truth or continue pretending it doesn't exist. The answer may still be unfolding, but the direction is becoming clearer every day. What makes this realization so powerful is that it is changing more than just one decision. It is changing the way they see themselves. They are beginning to understand that real growth happens when people stop allowing fear to control every step. Real growth happens when they stop asking what feels easiest and start asking what feels true. Your soulmate is reaching that point now. The confusion is fading. The emotional fog is lifting, and in its place, a deeper understanding is emerging. They are realizing that some choices are not meant to be made from a place of fear. They are meant to be made from a place of honesty. And for the first time in a very long while, they are preparing to let honesty guide them toward whatever comes next. And now your soulmate finds themselves closer than ever to the moment that will change everything. The uncertainty that once surrounded them is slowly disappearing. The confusion that kept them stuck between different possibilities no longer feels as powerful as it once did. After all the reflection, all the questioning, and all the emotional battles they have fought within themselves, one thing has become impossible to ignore. They cannot continue standing still forever. Life is moving forward, and the choice they have been avoiding is demanding an answer. Whether they are fully ready or not, they can feel that a turning point is approaching. What makes this moment so significant is that your soulmate is no longer looking at the situation through the eyes of fear. For a long time, fear influenced everything. Fear of making the wrong decision, fear of disappointment, fear of vulnerability, fear of stepping into the unknown. Those fears created hesitation and uncertainty. They made every decision seem more complicated than it truly was. But something has shifted. Through all of their reflection, they have started realizing that fear has never actually provided peace. It only delayed difficult conversations and postponed important truths. The longer they relied on fear for guidance, the more disconnected they felt from what their heart truly wanted. Now they are beginning to understand something powerful. Every meaningful chapter in life requires a choice. Every major transformation begins with a moment when someone decides to stop living according to old patterns. And your soulmate is reaching that moment. They are beginning to see that continuing to avoid the truth would create far more pain than facing it. The idea of remaining trapped between possibilities no longer feels comfortable. In fact, it feels exhausting. They are tired of questioning themselves. They're tired of wondering what could happen. They are tired of carrying emotions that have never been fully expressed or understood. For the first time, they are seriously considering what it would feel like to move forward with complete honesty. As this realization grows stronger, another change is taking place within them. They are no longer focused on what they might lose. Instead, they are starting to focus on what they might gain. They're beginning to imagine a future where decisions are guided by authenticity instead of fear. A future where they no longer need to suppress emotions that continue returning no matter how much time passes. A future where they stop resisting what their heart has been trying to reveal. And every time they imagine that future, it feels more real. It feels more possible. It feels more aligned with who they are becoming. And listen carefully, because this may be the most important part of all. The difficult choice that once felt impossible is no longer creating the same level of confusion. The answer may not have fully arrived yet, but the direction is becoming clearer. Every experience they have gone through recently has led them toward greater understanding. Every emotional challenge has revealed something important. Every moment of reflection has brought them closer to the truth. And that truth continues pointing in the same direction, toward honesty, toward courage, toward a life that reflects what they genuinely feel rather than what they think they should feel. Deep inside, your soulmate knows that this chapter cannot continue forever. The time for endless hesitation is coming to an end. The emotional walls that once protected them are becoming weaker. The excuses that once felt convincing are losing their power. What remains is a growing awareness that some opportunities deserve to be acknowledged before they become regrets. Some connections deserve to be understood before they are forgotten. And some decisions deserve to be made from the heart rather than from fear. That is why this moment feels different from everything that came before it. Your soulmate is no longer running in circles. They are no longer hiding from the truth. They are no longer pretending that their feelings are insignificant. Instead, they are moving toward clarity. They are moving toward acceptance. They are moving toward a choice that has the power to reshape their future. And while they may still have a few steps left before everything becomes fully clear, one thing is already certain. You became the reason they were forced to face this difficult choice. And in doing so, you also became the reason they finally started discovering who they truly are and what their heart has wanted all along.